Okay, hi everybody. As I've said multiple times in the last few minutes, I'm Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality. I want to thank you for joining our OV webinar, this is actually the first webinar we're doing in 2022. We usually do a series of these throughout the year, and this is number one of the year 2022. So welcome. And I want to especially thank you for coming and being with us, while the world goes through all the turmoil that we're experiencing, and thanks for making the time to sharing some of your time with us. We're excited to be presenting on a topic that seems to crop up, for me anyway, in company after company that we talk to. And it's also receiving quite a bit of media attention these days. Today, we're going to go a little bit off-road of the way the employee experience, though, is often talked about. And the purpose of us going off-road is a little bit, we want to stimulate some of your thinking on the topic. We want to give you a few ideas and concepts you can take back to your own organization. But before we jump in, just some administrative housekeeping. We're going to try and leave some time at the end. Scott and I have timed this, and we're going to try and leave some time at the end for the Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go, please use the Q&A screen. We'll be monitoring that, and as questions come up, we'll answer them at the end. If we don't get to the questions at the end, we'll be happy to take it offline and answer any questions you might have. The slides will be sent to you afterwards, as well as a workbook that we're putting together about how to explore the idea of the employee experience at your own organization. The workbook will probably follow in a day or two after the webinar. We're still putting the finishing touches off on that. There'll also be a short survey at the end of today's session, and we would appreciate you taking the time to fill it out because we would appreciate the feedback. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I'm Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality, and I'll be joined today by one of the co-founders of the firm, Scott Brooks. Scott?
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm Scott, and like Jeff, one of the founders of OrgVitality, and delighted to chat with you today. Let me get started with an observation, which is, EX, or employee experience, is clearly important. That's not in question. That's never in question in what we're going to present. One of the things I wanted to start with, though, is that there's an enthusiasm to embrace it that sometimes runs amok. So let me illustrate. Has anybody heard this specific stat that organizations that invest in employee experience outperform peers by 147% in earnings per share? Now, you think about something like that, and it's, I guess, a pretty bold statement, almost sounds like a guarantee, and it very distinctly sounds causal. But, we're scientists at heart, and so we did a little research on this and tried to figure out where it came from. And it's a little bit like playing telephone, where each step of the way, some of the original research gets just a little bit twisted. And so where did this come from? Well, I think it was last December, Workday was quoting a report by KPMG. Okay, that's great. Well, look up the KPMG report, which is nice and goes into a lot about the employee experience. They got this stat from Harvard Business Review. Okay, great. So you look that up. Actually, it was not a Harvard Business Review article. It was a blog post that cited Gallup. Say, okay, let's look about that. And well, Gallup was talking about their specific definition of engagement. They weren't really talking about employee experience overall. And that was from research done about 10 years ago. So we're researchers, and we want to be clear and precise to the extent that we can about what it is that we're talking about and what it is that we're measuring. So when we find out that Workday was actually quoting research that was derived from Gallup's Q12, but broadening it to the employee experience, we say, all right, spirit's good, all right, but let's be a little bit more rigorous here. And actually, if you go back to some of that original Gallup research, one of the better critical interpretations is, in fact, not organizations that invest outperform, but successful organizations are better places to work than unsuccessful ones. So a little bit of the reverse causality makes a little bit more sense in some of this. So like I said, we're scientists and we like to define things. So let's talk a little bit about definitions of employee experience.
So we examined the literature out there, or the marketing literature out there anyway, say, how are people defining employee experience? And there's lots of operational definitions put out by organizations that would like to work with you on your employee experience. And some of them are the employee experience are things that make work less stressful, right? New benefits, vacation incentives, perks, things like that. Others will say it's what people encounter and observe over the course of their tenure at the organization. Another one was it's everything the worker sees, does, learns, and feels while they're employed with your company. Finally, another one we found is every interaction that happens along the employee life cycle. So lots of operational definitions out there in the world by companies promoting the employee experience, but it basically boils down to the employee experience is everything, right? And if it's everything, and everything is important to measure, including measuring, improving items that are critical to organizational success, how do you know what to measure? And you begin to fall back on things that are familiar and comfortable to you. And you might be guessing right, you might be guessing wrong, but it's somewhat of a guessing game in terms of, are we emphasizing the things that are important for the employee experience in our organization? So, how do you begin? How do you think this through? Because if you're measuring everything and everything's important, essentially nothing is important, right? Because you're not differentiating between the more and the less important. You're saying it's everything, right? And based on those definitions, right, from the previous page, here are some of the very topics that the employee experience could be. It could be about transactions, for instance, could be about equity, could be about aspirations, could be about emotions, could be about life events, or day-to-day workplace cultural experiences, feeling valued, for instance, or being mentored, camaraderie, right, inclusivity and belonging. Or it could be even work processes, like things like team formation or reorganization, or even the last part down here, safety, right? So safety at the bottom of the list is often not thought of, right, in the same breath as these other topics as being part of the employee experience. But I don't think any of you are going to argue with me that the safety of a work environment is part of what day-to-day, what an employee will experience, right? So, what can be done, Scott? What can be done? Let's take a closer look at safety. Let's look at the impact that something like safety can have on the employee experience, and perhaps the unexpected benefits of looking at it. So many of you may have heard this story before. Some of you, this may be new, but in 1987, Alcoa was struggling with market share, with product quality, profitability, and they brought in a new CEO, a guy named Paul O'Neill. And his first meeting with the board and with investors have become somewhat legendary. He said to the board and the his management team that he was going to transform Alcoa. He decided he was going to start by focusing on one thing. His intention was to make Alcoa the safest company in America. He intended to go for zero injuries. Now the board was like, they wanted to hear from him how he was going to improve the product, how he was going to reduce expenses, how he was going to increase profitability. And his response when they brought that up is, you're not listening to me. If you want to know how Alcoa is performing, you're going to ask me about safety, right? So he held to his guns, and in the environment in Alcoa, he installed a very safety-oriented environment. He had on-the-job work instructions, safety checklists, task management, safety leaderboards. It resulted in a progressive and a very transformative culture. And we did employee surveys way back when too, as well, measuring employee safety, perceptions of employee safety in Alcoa. Alcoa dropped from 1.86 work days lost for each injury down to 0.2 lost work days, a decrease that even his management team said it was impossible to achieve. But what were the benefits of that? Alcoa's market share increased from 3 billion to 27 billion. Net income went from 200 million to 1.48 billion by focusing on a single important strategic habit, worker safety. Now we're going to get into how did that happen in just a little bit. but let's talk about what's important to measure versus what's strategic to measure for just a second here. I want to draw a distinction between things that are important. There's lots of things that are important out there, right? Employee safety would be an important topic. For Alcoa, it was also determined to be strategic. May not be strategic in other organizations. Things like diversity is important. It may not be strategic. It may find a important place in the organization because it falls into a category we would call a moral imperative, right? There are things that out there that are important to measure. We're not saying don't measure those, but there are things to really focus on that have a strategic benefit to both the employees and to the organization. So you want to really zero in on the strategic and the important, as well as the moral imperatives that we're going to get into in just a minute. Okay? So.
Right. So to identify what's in that strategic circle, we need to ask a basic question. What really is strategy? So here's a lightning review. And when we say strategy, by the way, we're not talking about strategy in the colloquial sense, which is sometimes a synonym for important. We're talking about strategy in sort of the Michael Porter organizational strategy literature in terms of what really helps define an effective organizational strategy. So the first thing is to be strategic is to be unique. So there's a phrase out there that was actually just used in relation to Facebook and trying to use its new Reels product as sort of a TikTok alternative. And it was saying, hey, you're never going to be a better version of your competition, right? You cannot copy your way to success. So strategies, what they do is they capitalize on factors that competitors find costly or impossible to copy. Even nonprofits are trying to do something unique generally. And so some of our phrasing might be a little for-profit, but strategic implications apply also to nonprofits or NGOs. And one implication of this is that off-the-shelf approaches are generic, not unique, and therefore they do not help you provide a competitive advantage, right? They don't support that secret sauce that makes you uniquely you. Second thing is strategy is about choices, right? They suggest pursuing certain paths over others and directly address challenges and bottlenecks. Do you turn left or do you turn right? Do you develop a distribution channel in India or do you double down on internet sales? These are the kinds of things that a strategy is really all about. And so an implication here, again, is strategy is not synonymous with success, right? Just the same way it's not synonymous with important, but rather it defines how to become successful. And to echo this point in a slightly different way, strategy is not ambition, and strategies suggest how to achieve goals or ambitions. They are not the goal or ambition itself. So the implication here is that increasing market share, increasing customer loyalty, getting more money in the bank, or whatever it is, those are ambitions or goals. To say, hey, it's our strategy to increase market share, it's like, no, that's our goal, that's our ambition. That's not a strategy of how to increase market share. And really the same thing can be said of employee engagement. Employee engagement is like an ambition. It's a good thing. It's not unique. It doesn't really suggest choices of going left or right. And so that by itself also is not really strategy. So if we pull back to more generally about employee experience, then we can ask the question, what is strategic with respect to the employee experience?
So safety at Alcoa was a strategic differentiator for both the company and the employees. It required a cultural shift, and it resulted in greatly improved performance, right? And I don't think anybody would argue with me that improving safety changed the employee experience, but it worked its magic because it was also strategic. So how did that happen? So improving safety required workers to work more carefully, which yielded higher quality, which yielded more customer satisfaction, which yielded greater market share, which yielded better financial performance. And as you know, Alcoa really became absolutely dominant in their market because Paul O'Neill picked the right thread to pull on. And by pulling on that thread, all these other things came along with it. And the thread that he pulled on had something to do with the employee experience.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we determine, right? How do we determine which employee experiences are strategic for your organization, right? And will have the beneficial impacts to both the employees and the organization overall. Let's explore that a bit.
Yeah, so let's go back to this theme. And another way to phrase that question is, how do we define what's in the smaller strategic circle versus just the larger blue circle? What is not just important, but the strategic secret sauce that nestles within it. So we're going to play a little game, strategic or not. All right. So Jeff, I'm going to ask you a question here. Number one, safety. Is safety strategic?
Safety is critical, right? But it's usually not strategic unless in Alcoa you find out that pulling on that safety thread will have lots of other benefits for the organization. Mm-hmm. So Scott, what about employee engagement?
Yeah. As I would allude to, generally no. Engagement does not provide unique insights into the challenges that your organization is facing. So it's kind of like gas in the tank. It's not something that is special to where you're going to go. All right, Jeff, what about retention? Is employee retention strategic?
Employee retention as a concept in and of itself is not strategic. What would be strategic about retention is preserving the competencies required for the organization to execute on its strategic plan or on its work. So retention in and of itself is not strategic, just saying, oh, we want to retain employees. The real strategy underneath that is, how do we make sure the organization retains the skill sets that are needed to do what it's out there trying to do? Scott, mm-hmm. What about onboarding?
That's another good one. I would say, same way. Now, but if your strategy is requiring a certain fast growth and a certain agile expansion, right, then maybe it is strategic to bring new talent up to speed faster, something like that. Okay, Jeff, what about compliance climate?
Well, sorry, but no again. But for the financial services people navigating new Department of Labor regulations, well, that certainly could be at the top of the list. And in fact, it could be strategic to navigate these regulations successfully. Mm-hmm. And Scott, the last one on this chart, what about managerial skill, recognition, career growth, service, orientation, or innovation or efficiency?
Well, no. So hopefully you're feeling that it's a dependent question here, and maybe you're feeling confused, but here's a very, very extreme example. Is air strategic? No. Is it important? 100%. I don't think any organization on the planet would be successful without some oxygen to breathe. But unless you happen to be a Navy SEAL or doing something special that in relation to air, that's not going to be strategic. So we can move to the question, can these all be strategic? And the answer is, well, the first answer, no, at least not at the same time. And so how do we begin to weave through what is strategic or not? So it's not the topic itself that's inherently strategic. It's the topic that fits your organization. And the first piece of advice is, don't start with important topics and then try to figure out which ones are strategic. That's going to bog you down. You're going to get in some weeds. You're going to try to deal with too many things. Instead, start from the other direction. Start with the end in mind, with a strategy first mindset, which will lead you into maybe the one or two ways where you're trying to rise above the rest. So here's some acid test questions that you can ask yourself, right? So your element of employee experience is more likely to be strategic if the topic originated from the core interests of executives, right? If you're looking to bust paradigms versus simply looking to try to improve, that's an important one. If you've got fewer than a handful of topics that are declared strategic, 1, 2 is great, 3 maybe, much more than that, you're going to run into trouble. And that this is really central to what the organization is trying to achieve, in actually to get done in terms of the work it's there to do. Like Alcoa. Your element is less likely to be strategic if the topic originated from maybe traditional HR topics. You're looking for efficient best practices to improve how things are done, or maybe you've got a half dozen or more kinds of things. So let's review these for a second. Jeff, how do these match up to Alcoa?
Well, the first four would certainly be strategic for Alcoa. It originated from core interests of the executives. It was paradigm busting. No one else in the industry had a safety record like he achieved. He had just a single topic, safety, and everything flowed from that. And it was central to what the organization was trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. If you then look at these other three, the topic originating from traditional HR topics, that's a bit of a question mark, because if some of these HR topics could be strategic. Sometimes safety is in fact part of what HR does. In other organizations, it's a separate area of concentration. But things like looking for efficient or best practice improvements, no. And was it a half dozen or more? No, it was single focus. Go back to Scott's statement on the air, right? And saying that, well, oxygen could be strategic, if you're a Navy SEAL. Where you're really getting into strategic success, if you think about that one, is if the Navy SEALs on your team are able to stay underwater an extra half an hour because you have some new technology that delivers a more capacity of oxygen to them, allowing them to outperform the enemy in that kind of environment. That's the strategic nature of air. In other words, how do you use it to your competitive advantage? So part of the acid test, right, is in terms of what's critical in terms of thinking about what's strategic, is how central this whole thing is to the employee or to what the organization is trying to accomplish. So, for instance, increasing the talent pool by implementing a rigorous DEIB kind of plan, it can be strategic, but it could also be a moral imperative. So the question is, say, for instance, a DEI situation, why are you doing that? You're trying to get more varied talent within the organization. That would be the strategic aspect of it. Improving safety as a way of improving quality can be strategic, and also can be a moral imperative, because most people like to go home after work, in one piece, right? So not only is it a moral imperative, like people shouldn't be injured at work, but it's also can be strategic if it changes the way the work processes get done. Improving top line by introducing a new product or moving to new geographies can be strategic as well. There's no way around thinking about it uniquely for your situation. You can't copy other people's homework. In other words, Target doesn't get successful as it has been by simply saying, let's go out there and be like Walmart. That's not what it was about. Target differentiated itself from Walmart, and that's why Target has been as successful as it has been.
Mm-hmm. So let's move from this, where we're talking about sort of concepts, to a little bit more discussion on explicit survey work or employee listening programs. So there is a fundamental sort of structure that we have when we think about creating sustainable change. And that is, you need strategy, defining what change it is that we're trying to do. What's the purpose in this case of your survey or your listening program? You've got the insight, which is how do you generate the data, share results, and create that evidence-based array to characterize what the situation is, maybe suggest what to do, and then action. It's like what really drives efforts to create change. And from all our work over the years in doing this kind of thing, the big lesson is you start with strategy and action, and then you let the insight and the mechanics follow. You can't start with the green circle first. You can't start with, say, hey, let's do continuous listening and figure out how to make it strategic and make people act. Instead, you got to start with what's our purpose, what drives action, and then sort of find the insight mechanics in the middle of that, those two bookends. So with that in mind, let's dive into some of the insight and look at measuring the employee experience. And sometimes this is called, trying to address the moments that matter. One frame on employee experience and trying to sift through everything it could be is focusing on moments that matter. So what's some quick advice that we have for you? Number one, you can leverage annual surveys. A lot of people feel that if you're doing an annual survey, that you're in the minority, that most people have moved on to some other kind of ongoing, continuous type of process, or even some passive listening kind of thing. Actually, that's not true. Most organizations, and there's a lot of literature to support this and examples, most organizations still do an annual employee survey. And it's a great place to start. You've got it in play. And so, even if you can't change the survey itself, you can be thinking about this, aligning some of the concepts or topics in the survey with what's strategic. It can change your analyses or some of your action assignments to focus on more of the strategic elements of employee experience. And so forth. Second, you can extend into other moments, right? So onboarding and exit surveys do make a solid foundation for additional moments to try to measure. They're fairly generic, right? But they're great. Why not? But we would encourage you to identify other unique moments that are relevant for some of your pivotal populations. Is there a new product launch? Is that a moment? What about regular ongoing customer interactions? What kind of moments are those? Or you might be engaged in mergers and acquisitions, very significant moment. Or, hey, maybe there's a pandemic that you have to deal with. And what does that mean in terms of transforming the work? So extending into other moments. Next is maybe widen the matter part of moments that matter beyond just employee-centric concerns. Performance-centric or strategy-centric observations are not simply valuable, but they can be more predictive as well. For example, the best predictors of future customer loyalty within survey or listening programs is service climate, hands down. The best predictors for safety, safety climate. Best predictors for innovation, innovation climate. Compliance, compliance climate. All of these things are true, and there's a generalized statement that we can make, which is, hey, the best predictor of X is X climate or questions about X. Engagement, for example, does okay at a lot of things, but it's almost rarely the best predictor of any single thing. But to anchor some of this, let me give you 4 examples about this and then how they crystallize some of the action assignments based on these data, and how the purpose began to suggest some of the machinery that was used. So 4 examples. Number 1, here's a tech company emerging from dependence on venture capital funding. All right, very important. And they had established a new sales strategy in order to get more revenue and drive the top line that demanded client co-creation of solutions and very cross-functional delivery. Well, you can start to already imagine what kinds of employee experiences does this require to be successful. Collaboration, creativity were paramount, right? Particularly in customer-facing folks, whether you were in sales or service or engineering or whatever it happened to be. And so you could start to map out that this changed analysis, this changed the content of the survey, this changed the focus, this changed the executive presentation and discussions and emphases throughout the organization. Here's another quick example, financial services. Jeff alluded to this already, that with emerging Department of Labor regulations in the United States that required certain new compliance, how do they achieve that without compromising their service? Hey, whatever the customer wants, it was their brand. And so compliance climate, service climate became the sides of the employee experience that were most critical. And particularly for this organization, they needed to see, were these 2 types of climate actually paddling in the same direction, and how do we manage it when it's not? Very interesting story. We could talk about that another time, but let me just move on to the next example. Here's a client that had dramatic organizational growth. They had some tremendous opportunities with products they had to really push across the entire planet, and they needed certain scaling of workforce competencies to make that happen, particularly in innovation positions. And so preserving that talent and bringing new talent up to speed very, very quickly was their pivotal issue. And so the new employee experience, how do people come on board? And it became a great question that we helped really examine, which was, what part of onboarding support really drove faster productivity for the newbies? Great question. very specific to this organization. One last example, a hospitality chain, when it opens a new property, it wants to open hot, which is, a certain success of occupancy rate on the grand opening weekend really is deemed open hot. So how do you adjust for that? Well, in the weeks leading up to a grand opening, there's a lot of activity. A lot of employees are very active in making things happen. And so a confident, enthusiastic staff, as you approach a grand opening, can help diagnose and treat glitches. You can ask the question, are we going to open gracefully and on fire? Or if not, why not? Is it that the internet's not reaching the corner rooms? Is it that the kitchen's in chaos or something else? You can also map this kind of a thing into any kind of product launch in whatever kind of organization you might be in. If you've got a new event coming where it's going to be transformative to the organization, how confident are people as that approaches? And if not, why not? Can be a great way to diagnose problems. Now, there's a key point I don't want to leave behind that we've been echoing through here, which is that these listening programs covered more than just the critical few strategic priorities, right? They covered what's important, or Jeff was talking about moral imperatives, or maybe some other things. However, they were designed to highlight and drive action towards these strategic outcomes above all else. That was the spinal cord. That was the foundation. That was the sort of critical pivot points of all of these programs. So let's keep going. Let's go back to one of our favorite pictures in this webinar.
So let's take a step back for just a moment and talk about, so does that mean that you don't measure, you don't look at what's just plain important? And importantly, we're not suggesting that all you do is focus on strategic issues. Many other topics are important or are moral imperatives and need to have attention paid to them. So for instance, fundamentals unrelated to a competitive edge may need work, right? If your management team doesn't give good feedback on performance, or say communications is very poor, that might not be strategic from an organizational success standpoint, but it's certainly extremely important to the successful functioning of an organization internally. Additionally, values-based or moral imperatives, right, help you define who you are, right? So ethics, right, and things of that sort, they mean, being an ethical employer, having people feel you're ethical, that may not come out as very high on the strategic circle, but it certainly is absolutely critical and absolutely important, because something like ethics defines who you're going to be and how you're going to operate as an organization. And those kind of things shouldn't be overlooked. What we are saying is that in addition to the important things, what you want to make sure you do is identify the strategic items that are absolutely critical, that differentiate your organization, that help push performance of the organization, and make sure it's part of the employee experience, and make sure you're monitoring it by whatever measurement technique you're using to keep moving that strategic imperatives in the right direction, right? But you also want to make sure you focus on the things that will have that strategic impact, not just the important ones, right? And by all of this, we're also saying, it's important, it's okay. I mean, we're throwing a lot at you. We're throwing a lot at you that you may not have thought of this way before. And it's okay if your aspirations exceed your grasp. In other words, you can't do everything. You can't be everything to everyone. If your current measurement in your organization is about feedback and communications and decision making and training, that's okay. Those are important things, and we're not denigrating those in any way, shape, or form. So it's okay if your aspirations to go out and let's measure all these strategic things don't happen right away, but it's something for you to keep in mind as you think through where are you going with your employee experience in the organization and how you're going to be monitoring that. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, another way to think about this is I know that in the audience right now, we have people with a variety of backgrounds and experiences and positions within an organization. And some of you might say, we don't have access to executive conversations on the big strategic debates. We don't really know exactly how that fits, or maybe HR strategy is not exactly strategic in the sense of it doesn't help maximize the uniqueness of the organization's competitive edge. Instead, maybe it's just fundamentals of HR, which can be okay. And so you're trying to figure out, where do we sit? But we still believe in the value of this thinking. It helps shape what you can do. Even if you can't change the full-on program, you can change some of your analysis, the dialogue about it, the assignments that you create for action, the positioning, and everything like that. So anyway, just let this drift as places where you can go. But let's move from this to sort of summarizing where we've been so far. So, Jeff?
I think the first point is currently the employee experience, the way it's defined, is very vague with no consistent focus. I think, and that's one of the things we want you to get out of this. Second, while a great deal can be important or a moral imperative, not all of that which is important or a moral imperative is in fact strategic. Third, organizational strategy is unique with guided choices that set you apart from the competition. What are you going to do differently to beat the competition? Scott?
So that takes us to number 4, where your goal, in a way, is to identify what are the 1 to 2 elements of the employee experience that are required for strategic execution. Not so easy, but research can help, conversations with folks like us can help, so forth. And then there's 5. So then you want to design the employee listening programs to focus on those, and measure other important factors, but design for that strategic focus. And then finally, you want to design for action, not simply insight, particularly at the executive level of your organization. When you are doing things with a strategic intent, it is hard to delegate all the action to managers at large. Managers at large can have a lot to do. They can certainly follow up on strategic topics and everything. But if it's a strategic topic and it has no action at the executive level, you're sort of missing an opportunity. So that's the summary. Jeff, before the Q&A, any questions? Any other final statements?
Well, one thing I do want to mention is the workbook that you'll be getting in a couple days. It talks you through identifying, for instance, what's important for your particular company, and out of what's important, what are the strategic variables that you should be focusing on. So the workbook is really around helping you define or helping you decide what is strategic within your own organization. So that is going to be on its way to you as in addition to the slides here, right? So if you do have any questions about anything we talked about, I know we covered an awful lot in a short period of time. Use the Q&A box and put your questions in there, and we'll take a few minutes to answer those. And while we're waiting for those to come in, we want to bring your attention to the next webinar that's coming up about cracking the code to effective talent optimization, which is April 5th at 12 o'clock. So you can register for this webinar also at OrgVitality.com. And Scott, I just have a few questions. The first question that came in is, what are your thoughts on focusing only on items that impact or drive engagement? What are the pros and cons of this approach? In other words, I think, what if all we do is measure employee engagement? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, it can be great, right? Is driving engagement itself strategic? I would say no. If you think about like the metaphor of a car, driving engagement is kind of like filling up the gas tank. What is strategic is what engaged employees are supposed to do, right? So like what are the choices? Expand into China versus drive internet sales, or match the balance of compliance versus service, which sometimes run at odds with each other to sort of refine your brand. Those can be strategies. Engaged employees will enthusiastically do maybe whatever you tell them to do, but what's strategic is whatever they're supposed to do. So a survey that is only focused on engagement and drivers of engagement might create a fairly good employee experience, but it's like filling up the gas tank. It tells you nothing about where's the car is headed, about is the engine in tune, are the tires flat, that kind of thing.
Or do employees believe you're headed in the right direction? Are they with you? Yes.
Yeah. So they're it can be good, it can be fine, but it might not tap into what executives talk about. Just a quick thing about that, Department of Labor compliance climate thing. That started with executive interviews where I was talking to one executive, not an HR executive, he was an operations guy. And he said, hey, 75% of our board conversations deal with new Department of Labor regulations. And so if that wasn't addressed in some fashion in their listening programs, then the listening programs did not have relevance for that 75% of airtime in the conversations with board of directors. Not that that's synonymous with strategic, but it's a pretty good indicator of what occupies their airtime.
One of the things I'd add to that, by the way, probably 75-85% of the employee surveys we do today always have a measure of employee engagement on them. It's not that we do away with that, but what we urge organizations to do is go beyond simply measuring employee engagement, and let's measure some of the strategic aspects of what the organization is trying to accomplish as well. Here's another question, Scott. So, there's corporate strategy and there's HR strategy. How should those two be aligned?
Well, in an ideal world, HR strategy should follow from corporate strategy, right? Where corporate strategy is about how to define your uniqueness in a competitive situation, and HR strategy should be how do you support that, right? So not just onboarding, but bring people up to speed in the talents and competencies that are required to execute on that strategy. Or, you think about, let's play this out in the Great Resignation. Is it, first of all, let's set aside whether or not it's real or relevant for you, because there's a lot of debate about that and it's not quite matching the hype that's in the news. But let's say it is relevant for you. Should it be HR strategy to stop the flow of quitting? Well, you could say, yeah. And a lot of HR programs, are just designed to do that. But it would be a little better if the HR strategy were to say, well, what are we losing, right? And if you work for Taco Bell, it's going to be very different than if you work for Eli Lilly, let's say. And so what is the retention that is required to keep the lights on and that kind of stuff? That could still be an HR strategy. But I think HR does have a role that's very central to its self-definition that might not be in corporate strategy. And that was echoed a little bit before with Jeff, you were talking about moral imperatives and stuff like that. It's to represent sort of the voice of the employee, to bring employee concerns to the table, to sort of represent the human side of organizations. And so all of that can be very significant inside an HR strategy that might be a little bit different from corporate strategy. So I just want to mention that it's a fabulous question, and there's a lot that can be said, but there's a start of it.
And here's a somewhat tangentially related question. So going back to the Alcoa example, where he basically transformed the employee experience by focusing on safety. So in your experience, Scott, when people make a transformation like that, is that a shock to the system and to the organizational system, to the culture and so forth? And how do you cope with that if it is a huge shock to the system, so to speak?
shock to the system, let me give not quite a synonym, but it's, are you paradigm busting, right? Paul O'Neill came in and he wanted to paradigm bust. And he was trying to assert things and do things that were way outside paradigm, which kind of implies a shock to the system. And so HR's strategic role in that would be to help the organization embrace and support that challenge. And so there's a lot on, innovation or change that's paradigm busting versus incremental or engineering kind of innovations that we could talk about. But that's what I would say about shocks.
One thing we also know, both from our data and from the research in the field, is things like employee satisfaction, things like employee engagement are also dependent not only on the absolute state of where the organization is, but on a sense of either forward or negative momentum. So, and it tends to build on itself. So Paul O'Neill comes in and said, we're going to focus on safety. And they begin to see some positive results from that focus. And it becomes a self-reinforcing positive feedback loop. Well, as the organization improves, people begin to buy into it some more. The organization improves even more. People buy in even stronger. So it's very, very true that as important as sort of the absolute level of where the organization is performing, a sense of either forward or negative momentum has a huge impact on how people respond to these employee experience measurements as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Jeff, here's another question that just popped in. When you're developing an employee life cycle survey process, like candidate experience, new hire, annual survey, exit, how do you decipher what's strategic from what's just important across so many different but equally important surveys?
Yeah, one of the things I would do, and I'm sure there's more than one answer to this, but one of the things I would do is I look at the organizational goals, the organizational level strategy. In other words, why are you measuring new hires? Why are you measuring the candidate experience? What are you hoping to gain? It's like when someone asks me, we want to measure employee engagement. I immediately push back and say, why? And, if they say, because everybody else is, you push back some more. I'm like, what are you hoping it does for you? What are you hoping it accomplishes for you? Do you want it higher because you think it's going to drive better customer service experiences? What's the goal? So the same thing with the candidate experience, new hire, and annual, and the exit survey is you should be able to define for each one of those, what do you want it to do for you? What's the goal? What's the strategy with that? And how does that strategy align with what the corporation overall is trying to do?
I've got an example of that, which is you can think about onboarding surveys, and you can have different touch points and so forth. Are you doing onboarding surveys for why, right? And you could think about several different purposes. One is we have too much turnover within 3 months right after people show up. Okay, that's one sort of problem to solve. Second one is we have very unique skill sets in our organization. And so once people are on board, we have to train them up and otherwise give them the experiences so they know what to do. That's a very different sort of onboarding challenge. Or, with recruiting and so forth, it's like, do people choose us or not over where they could have other jobs and so forth. So all of these things are slightly different pursuits. Now, they're all can be important. But which ones are strategic? You could sort of think about it's like if I'm Taco Bell versus if I'm Eli Lilly looking at scientists, I'm going to have vastly different strategies and requirements for what turnover means to me. And how do you bring somebody up to speed? At Taco Bell, it's the beeps and buzzers that sort of tell you what to do when you're cooking a taco. But in developing medicines and vaccines and things like that, that's a very different sort of skill set to acclimate to your organization. And so, you don't, all of these things, it's sort of implicit in that question was that all of these pivot points are equally important. That might not be true. You want to step back and say, what are the moments here that matter the most? And which ones do we want to chase, and what are we trying to achieve with it? So there's different goals that suggest different content and maybe different touch points in the life cycle kind of thing.
One final question, Scott. Do you have any tips for increasing response rate where it's dropped significantly during the pandemic?
Yeah. This might depend on the nature of the population. Going back to my Taco Bell versus Eli Lilly scientists, it's like, okay, how do I get response rates for that? But and are we talking about response rates for an annual survey, an exit survey, sort of a monthly pulse or whatever it might be? But I would say a couple things. Number one, and this is sort of known out there, that I think the idea of survey fatigue is a little bit of mislabeling. People are happy to fill out surveys if they believe something's going to happen. People complete little assignments of providing feedback on things all the time. So it's not survey fatigue. It's like, do I think this is valuable or worthwhile? Is one thing. So how do you demonstrate that? And you demonstrate that mostly through executive or management attention, or, demonstration of importance, which is not just declaring it. It's you show what's happened, right? And if you can't, then, maybe it's time to sort of refigure what it is that you're doing in the first place. But, most of the time, people will say, hey, how do we improve response rates? And we say, how much do you want to annoy people? Nothing beats just pummeling people with reminders, if you can, if it's an email-based survey kind of a thing. And so there's more that can be said, but that's.
I lied, Scott. There's another question that just popped into the chat, which is similar to the one you answered in some respects. Let me throw it to you. How do we frame multiple surveys throughout the year to encourage survey participation? And what do we do when employees feel like they're not being heard, action is not taking place?
We should do another webinar just on that topic.
Yeah.
But, how do you frame all the touch points through the year? Not every employee is going to be getting every touch point, right? The onboarding and the exit surveys, hopefully it's not the same people within the span of 1 year. It's important to have a larger map or model of what you're doing, where you can sort of show people, what's happening. We haven't really talked about, 360s or, different kinds of training and development assessments or other kinds of things that people are interacting with to help provide a bigger information landscape for employee insights as a whole. That's a big topic, but some sort of frame that has as the central theme something unique that your organization is trying to do. If we, when we work with clients and they have like a life cycle model and saying, okay, people join, they sort of do stuff and then they quit. It's like, yeah, that's fine, but that's not the way that organizational strategies think or are framed. Organizational strategies are framed in terms of an organizational evolution, which thinks not just of individuals coming and working and quitting, but the flow of individuals as they go through, and the ebb and flow of competencies and so forth. Like employee life cycle at Taco Bell, it's a revolving door, and so long as my systems can keep people trained enough, that might be okay. At Eli Lilly, with scientists who might be rare or unique in what they do and what they know and what they published and the kind of science they do, that's a very different thing. And in terms of maintaining stuff, so there's a lot going on, but make sure you shoot for a map that doesn't look like your competitors. It doesn't look like just any other HR best practice thing, but reflects uniquely the mantra of your CEO this year on into the next. And then that will help, I think.
and I'm going to block on the name, Scott, but there was the one guy at Eli Lilly who said a comment that it still sticks with me today.
Alan Colquitt.
Alan Colquitt, right? Which is the problem with continuous listening is that most of the efforts are really just continuous asking with no action and follow-up. And so they die a slow death, because if all we're doing is continuously asking with no action, people just stop participating because they don't see any positive results. So there's got to be this back end. We're asking for a reason. We're asking because we're going to take action based on the data.
Great.
Okay. Well, I think with that, any final words, Scott?
No, other than that, look for follow-up notes from us. Look for information in there about the next webinar. And thanks for your participation, and hope you have a great day.